What would you do if you had to decide, in less than an hour, who to save and who to leave behind forever? That's exactly what happened to Thundera. And the reason they reached that moment has a disturbing origin, a weapon they themselves buried generations ago, believing it would stay there forever. Long before Jaga was known as the Wise, long before his name was spoken with reverence in every corner of Thundera, Jaga was simply a young warrior who had inherited the responsibility of protecting something he didn't fully understand himself. The balance between two enemy worlds, Thundera and Plundar, was a civilization obsessed with brute power, with domination, with the idea that strength was the only currency that mattered in the universe. And among all the warriors that Plunder had produced, none was as feared, as relentless, as hungry for conquest as Ratilla. Ratilla did not return. He wasn't simply looking to invade Thundera. He was after something much more specific, a weapon capable of bending any will, capable of stripping any people of their will to resist. A sword forged in the darkest depths of Plundar, tempered with the accumulated hatred of entire generations of mutant warriors. That weapon had a name that over time would become synonymous with disaster, the Sword of Plundar. When Ratilla crossed the borders of Thundera wielding that sword, he arrived like a storm in the shape of a warrior. Entire villages fell. They fell before him in a matter of hours. The Thunderian soldiers, trained for years in hand-to-hand combat, found themselves facing something no discipline could prepare them for. A weapon that cut through flesh, and with it, seemed to cut through the will to fight as well. Whoever faced the Sword of Plundar felt their own strength leave them, as if the blade drank something more than just blood. It was then that Jaga, still young, still without the weight of the wisdom that would later define his name, decided he could not stand by while his people were being destroyed. He confronted Ratilla completely alone, carrying the determination of someone who knows he might die trying, and still chooses to try. The battle between them was told for generations as one of the most brutal confrontations Thundera had ever witnessed. Ratilla struck with uncontrolled fury, confident that no Thunderian could match the power of his sword. But Jaga did not fight with fury. He fought with patience, studying every move, waiting for the exact moment when his enemy's arrogance would create an opening. That opening came, and the one who never believed he would be defeated fell. With Ratilla defeated and banished back to what was left of the mutant forces, Jaga was left with something he never asked for and deep down feared: the Sword of Plundar. Any other warrior would have seen that weapon as a trophy, a proof of victory to display, to remind future generations of the day. Thundera stood strong, but Jaga felt something different. The first time he held it in his hands, a strange weight, heavier than metal, accompanied by a low vibration, almost imperceptible, as if the weapon was breathing. The sages of Thundera, who examined the sword, came to a conclusion that unsettled the entire royal council. That weapon was, in a way that no one could fully explain, a living fragment of the same rage that consumed Plundar. And such a fragment could not be kept in any treasure chamber, nor melted down, nor destroyed by any known fire. Jaga then made a decision that, as the years went by, would prove to be the mistake, the most tragic of his life. Although at that moment it seemed like the only reasonable way out. He traveled to the deepest canyons of Thundera, crevices so deep that not even the light of the planet's two suns could reach their bottom. And there, with his own hands, he threw Plundar's sword into the abyss. He watched as the weapon fell, spinning slowly until it was lost in the darkness. He heard, or thought he heard, a metallic echo that seemed endless. And when silence finally returned, Jaga allowed himself to think for the first and only time that the danger had been sealed away forever. No one would ever see that sword again. No one would ever when you walk through those canyons. Over time, the crevice would be covered with rock and dust, and the story of Ratilla and his weapon would be reduced to a legend that the elders told the young ones by the fire. A warning about ambition and its consequences. But Thundera couldn't know, that that sword hadn't been buried in a simple canyon. It had fallen, meter by meter, until it merged with something much deeper, the very core of the planet. Entire generations passed. Thundera flourished as it rarely had before in its history. The tribes that Megatheriad united centuries ago now lived under the same sky, under the same code of honor. The cities grew around the eye of Thundera. Glaudos ruled with the strength that had made him the greatest warrior of his generation. And Jaga, now advanced in years, walked among his people with the calm of someone who believes he has closed the darkest chapters of the past. No one spoke of Ratilla anymore. No one remembered the name of the sword that had nearly subdued the entire planet. For most of the Thunderians, that was ancient history. The kind of story told to teach a moral lesson, not a real threat that still breathed beneath their feet. But in the depths of Thundera, something had not completely died. The sword of Plundar, trapped in the molten rocks of the planet's core for all those years, never stopped being what it was. A weapon born from hatred. It doesn't find peace just because it was buried. And what Jaga took as a final silence was actually just the beginning of a wait. Here, I want you to pause for a moment and think about something. The most dangerous wars for a civilization are almost never the ones it sees coming. They're the ones it already believes ended a long time ago. And that, precisely, is what was about to happen to Thundera. And what follows next is the exact moment when that mistake from the past began to take its toll. The first tremors were so slight that almost no one noticed them. A barely perceptible vibration underfoot, a slight tinkling in the pots of the humblest homes. Something the elders attributed to the simple natural movement of a living planet. No one connected those tremors to a sword that far beneath the surface was still trying to free itself from the rock that imprisoned it. As if something inside it knew that its story with Thundera was not over yet. As the seasons passed, those slight tremors began to change in nature. They were no longer occasional vibrations that were forgotten the next day. They became more frequent, more intense, harder to ignore, even for those who refused to worry. The scientists and scholars of Thundera, who had been studying the planet's behavior for generations, began to record something that didn't fit any known pattern. The heat emanating from the core was steadily increasing. The measurements, which used to remain stable for decades, were now changing week after week. And most unsettling of all, the exact point from which all this activity seemed to originate matched almost perfectly with the location of the deepest canyons on the planet. The same canyons where generations ago, Jaga had thrown a weapon that everyone thought was forgotten. It was the chief of the royal scientists who, after months of study, dared to present before the court. A theory that to most sounded more like legend than science. That something buried in the heart of Thundera was struggling to break free, and that this something was the direct cause of all the tremors the planet had been suffering for months. The initial reaction was pure disbelief. It's easy, looking at history from the outside, to judge harshly those who ruled Thundera in those days. But you have to understand the context. They had lived through generations of peace. They had grown up hearing the legend of Ratilla as a cautionary tale, not as a real threat. And now suddenly a scientist was telling them that this story was real, that the weapon was still down there, and that its awakening could mean the end of everything they knew. Many in the court refused to believe it. They argued that the tremors had simpler, more earthly explanations. Natural changes in the planet's geological activity, cycles that had been seen before and had always ended up stabilizing on their own. They preferred that explanation. Of course, it was more comfortable. It didn't require evacuating entire cities or admitting that the mistake of a warrior made generations ago could be about to destroy them all. Jaga, however, listened to the chief scientist with an attentiveness that very few others showed him. Because Jaga knew something the rest of the court couldn't know with equal certainty. He was the one who had thrown that sword into the abyss. He had felt with his own hands the strange weight of that weapon. And if anyone in Thundera had reasons to take seriously the possibility that something so dark could still be alive beneath the surface of the planet, that someone was Jaga. It was Jaga who insisted against the opinion of much of the court that a contingency plan should be prepared just to have something ready if the situation got worse. It was an unpopular decision. There were those who called it an overreaction, even unnecessary. But that insistence, that silent stubbornness of a man who carried the guilt of a decision made decades ago, would be the only thing that would end up saving a handful of lives when there was no longer time to hesitate. And believe me, time ran out much faster than anyone imagined. The months of debate ended abruptly. The night Thundera suffered the most violent earthquake ever remembered in its history. A violent tremor that brought down entire structures in the regions closest to the deep canyons, that opened visible cracks in the ground, that made the very sky turn a sickly orange-red on the horizon. As if the planet were bleeding from within, there was no room left for doubt. There was no longer space for comfortable debate between those who believed and those who didn't. The chief royal scientist, with a pale face and a trembling voice, confirmed before the court what everyone feared. The core of Thundera was becoming irreversibly destabilized. The only question left was how much time remained before total collapse. Jaga had secretly ordered an evacuation plan to be prepared, but until that moment it was still just a theoretical draft. It was at that instant that they had to act. They had to activate it suddenly, without the preparation or the time they would have needed. Saving everyone was simply impossible. That is the harshest truth of this story, and it would be dishonest to tell it any other way. Thundera had ships, but far too few for the magnitude of the problem. Only a fraction of the capacity needed to move an entire civilization in a matter of days. Priorities had to be set with brutal speed. Protect the youngest, protect those who carried the lineage and the knowledge necessary so that, no matter what happened to the planet, the Thunderian people could survive somewhere else in the universe. The entire city became a sea of people running through smoke and dust, carrying what little they could take with them, searching for their families in the midst of the chaos. The royal guards tried to maintain some order at the boarding areas, but it was an almost impossible task when the ground itself shook beneath their feet every few minutes, reminding them that time was running out. Scenes in those final hours that no Thunderian historian ever dared to recount in full detail because they were too painful, even generations later. Parents separated from their children in the midst of the turmoil, shouting names that were lost among the roar of the departing ships. Elderly people who refused to leave the homes where they had lived all their lives, convinced that no tremor could overcome the strength of a home built over entire families who arrived at the boarding areas, only to discover that the last ship with available space had already closed its doors minutes before. There was no manual for a situation like this. There was no protocol capable of anticipating the loss of an entire planet in a matter of hours. Every decision, every instruction that Jaga and the rest of the Thunderian High Command gave at that moment was made on the fly, knowing that a single miscalculation could mean the difference between saving 100 more lives or losing them forever. And yet, in the midst of all that chaos, there was also something that many survivors would later remember with a strange mix of sadness and pride. No one, not a single guard, not a single noble, tried to board a ship before the children, the wounded, or the most vulnerable. The Code of Thundera, that set of values that would later define the Thundercats on Third Earth, was not born on a distant and unknown world. It was born right there, in the final minutes of a planet that was falling apart, in the way its people chose to behave, even when there was nothing left to gain and everything to lose. In the midst of all that chaos, the heaviest responsibility fell, once again, on the shoulders of Jaga. He was the one who took command of the Thundercats' royal ship, the most advanced vessel Thundera possessed, originally designed for diplomatic missions, and now turned overnight into the last hope of escape for those fortunate enough to board it in time. Those who would become legends over the years boarded it. Chitara, swift even in the midst of panic, helping guide the stragglers toward the boarding ramp. Tigro, calm despite the chaos around him. Pantro, with the physical strength needed to clear a path through the desperate crowd. The little ones, Felino and Felina, clinging to each other, too young to fully understand the magnitude of what they were losing. Snarf, faithful to the end, never letting go for a moment of the child under his care. And that child was Lion O. We're talking about a Thunderian barely 12 years old, aware of every second of what was happening around him, with his eyes wide open at the sight of his world collapsing. Lion-O was at that moment simply a scared child boarding a ship, not knowing if he would ever see his father again, with no idea that this same child, with the passage of time and under circumstances that even Jaga himself could not foresee, he would end up becoming the new lord of the Thundercats. Alongside the royal ship, a small flotilla of escort ships was organized, loaded with as many Thunderians as could be gathered in such a short time. But even as the hatches were closing, even as the engines began to roar, everyone knew that thousands of people were left on the ground who would not be able to board any ship. It was at that moment, with the royal ship about to take off, that Chlorus made a decision that would define the rest of his story. Chlorus, blind since the war against the mutants of Pluto, but never wavering in his determination, refused to board the royal ship at that first moment. The ship's guidance system had been damaged during the rushed evacuation, and without an emergency repair, the ship risked losing its course as soon as it reached space, condemning everyone on board to wander aimlessly in the darkness. Clodos, with the technical knowledge that only decades of ruling Thundera could give him, stayed behind to manually stabilize that system, fully aware of the risk he was taking by doing so. He entrusted Jaga with absolute responsibility for his son, for the future of the lineage, for everything Thundera represented, and with that silent gesture, he pushed the royal ship toward takeoff, staying behind on a planet that was already beginning to break apart from within. What Clodos didn't know, what no one on board the ship could have known at that moment, was that he was not alone on the ground. The Master of Shadows, exiled years ago to the realm of shadows after his defeat by Jaga and Clodos himself. He had waited for a moment just like that, an instant of absolute chaos. His defenses were completely focused on the evacuation, and no one would pay attention to the borders between this world and the dark realm he came from. Taking advantage of that crack between realities, the Master of Shadows managed to briefly return to Thundera just in the final minutes before the planet's total destruction. No one in the Thunderian court detected his return in time. The few guards left on the surface were focused on escorting the last groups of civilians to the remaining ships, and the surveillance system itself, which would normally have warned of a presence like his, had been out of service for hours, damaged by the same tremors that were destroying the planet. And he found Clodos alone, vulnerable, blind, fighting against time to save his people. There was no need for a long battle. The Master of Shadows captured Clodos and dragged him back to the realm of shadows just before Thundera collapsed completely. From the royal ship, as they moved away into space, no one saw that moment. Everyone assumed with a broken heart that Clodos had died on the planet along with everything else. No one imagined that in reality, he remained alive, a prisoner in a domain of shadow and silence, condemned to wait for years until someone managed to find and free him. While the royal ship struggled to escape the dying atmosphere of Thundera, not all the Thunderians were fortunate enough to reach the boarding points and get on in time. 3 of them, a young blacksmith of remarkable strength named Bengali, a swift and determined healer named Pumara, and a warrior named Lynx O. They ran to the last launch point, hoping to reach the royal ship before the gates closed for good. They didn't make it. The ship was already rising, already gaining altitude, already moving away from a planet that would cease to exist in a matter of minutes. They stayed there, the 3 of them, watching as their last chance disappeared into the sky, surrounded by a world that trembled with increasing violence. Salvation came from an unexpected source, a ship belonging to the Burbils, peaceful creatures who were also in transit, fleeing from the destruction. It happened to pass by at that critical moment, and, upon detecting the 3 stranded Thunderans, they didn't hesitate to pick them up. It was a rescue carried out with the bare minimum, with a ship already damaged with limited resources, but it was enough to get them off the planet alive before it completely collapsed. That same ship, however, would not get away unscathed. The accumulated damage would eventually force it, sometime later, to make a crash landing on a distant and unknown world. For all of them, a world that over time, they would learn to call home Third Earth. None of the 3 knew, at that moment, if they would ever see the rest of their people again. None of the 3 imagined that this forced separation would years later bring them back together with those who had escaped on the royal ship, writing together the next chapter in the story of the Thundercats. But that, as you know if you're familiar with this story, is material for another video. On board the royal ship, already in the emptiness of space, the relief of having escaped alive didn't last long. The mutants from Plundar, who had also witnessed the destruction of Thundera and saw in that moment of weakness the perfect opportunity to attack. They intercepted the small Thunderian flotilla almost immediately. The escort ships, one by one, were destroyed in the confrontation. Only the royal ship, protected by Jaga and those on board, managed to withstand the attack, though not without paying a price. The navigation system, already weak from the emergency repair that Clodos had made on land, finally collapsed during the battle. Without a reliable autopilot, someone had to take manual control of the ship for the rest of the journey, and that someone, without hesitation, was Jaga. He ordered everyone else on board to enter the suspension pods, the only viable way to survive such a long journey through space without consuming the limited resources they had left. Chitara, Tigro, Panthro, and Felina, Snarf, and the young Lion-O all entered one by one into that artificial sleep that would keep them alive for the rest of the journey. Jaga stayed awake, alone, in command of a damaged ship, traveling through space toward a destination he wasn't even sure he could reach alive. He knew his chances of surviving the entire journey were slim. He knew that probably he would not live to see with his own eyes the new home he was seeking for his people, and even so, he did not hesitate for a moment to take on that burden. He guided the ship through the darkness for what seemed like an endless time, manually correcting the course every time the system failed, keeping the ship stable solely through his own will and experience. Shortly before the ship finally reached the coordinates of a small, unknown blue planet far from any known Thunderian territory, Jaga's body finally gave in to the accumulated exhaustion of the entire journey. He died without ever seeing the planet that would later shelter Thundera's last children, but his guidance, his silent sacrifice during those last hours was what allowed the ship to reach its destination alive. During that lonely journey, with only the hum of the damaged engines and the absolute silence of space as company, Jaga had time to think about everything he had lost, and everything he still carried on his shoulders. He thought about Claudius, whom he believed dead without knowing the truth. He thought about Thundera, about the streets he had walked all his life, now turned to dust scattering through the void. And he thought about little Lion-O, asleep in his suspension capsule, still unaware of the weight he would one day have to bear. It was in those hours of absolute solitude that Jaga made one last decision. With the last strength he had left, he took the Sword of Omens in his trembling hands, not as a weapon, but as a vessel. There, in the eye of Thundera, he stored everything a man can keep before leaving. The story of his people, the weight of every decision he made as a wise man, and the certainty that the child sleeping in that ship would become much more than a king. The light of the eye shone for an instant, as if it accepted the burden of the responsibility that would fall on Lion-O when he finally awoke. He didn't do it out of vanity or fear of being forgotten. He did it because he understood better than anyone else that a people without memory is a people doomed to repeat its own mistakes, just as Thundera had repeated generations later, the mistake of a sword that should never have been buried and forgotten. So let's review everything we've just recounted. A sword born from the hatred of Plundar, wielded by Ratilla, defeated by a young Jaga, who never imagined the consequences of his own decision. A weapon thrown into the abyss, believing it would remain buried there forever, without knowing it would merge with the very core of the planet. Generations of peace built, unknowingly, upon a wound that never truly healed. A slow awakening, denied by many, warned in time only thanks to the stubborn insistence of a man who carried the guilt of his past. A planet breaking, apart from within, an impossible evacuation, where saving everyone was simply out of reach. A royal ship carrying the future of an entire people, in the form of a 12-year-old boy who still didn't know what awaited him. A father who stayed behind to save his own, and ended up a prisoner in a kingdom of shadows, believed dead for years. 3 young Thunderians stranded, rescued by creatures they barely knew, condemned to a fate separate from the rest of their people. And a lone guardian who guided the last survivors of Thundera through the emptiness of space, giving every last drop of his strength so that others could live. Even if it meant he would never see with his own eyes the world he had helped to find. Thundera no longer exists, but what Thundera represented, its code, its honor, its strength, did not die along with the planet. It traveled through space, asleep in stasis capsules, hidden in the heart of a boy who still didn't know he would become a leader, and that boy was about to find a new home in an unknown world, where a new story, the one we all know as the true adventure of the Thundercats, was just beginning. Thundercats was just starting.